Vladimir Putin says he agrees in principle with the proposal to end the fighting in Ukraine, but that any deal should lead to enduring peace.
President Putin says he supports the idea of the U.S. brokered Ukraine truce deal, but wants to discuss the details with President Trump.
Vladimir Putin has declared the fighting must end in Ukraine, but at the same time stopped short of agreeing to the US-backed 30-day ceasefire.
Tensions are rising on the world stage. Are we nearing the end of the Russia-Ukraine war? This critical question is resonating more strongly after the US-Ukraine talks in Jeddah. Kiev has accepted a 30-day ceasefire offer. All eyes are now on Vladimir Putin's decision. Will the Russian leader accept the ceasefire and silence the guns, or will he continue the offensive? In the midst of these questions, there is a powerful figure stepping in to ensure that Moscow backs down. Donald Trump. Trump sent a clear message to Putin. The US president has made it clear that if Russia does not accept the ceasefire, he will inflict serious damage on Moscow with heavy financial sanctions and economic moves.
In a financial sense, I can do things financially that would be very bad for Russia. I don't want to do that because I want to get peace. I want to see peace, and we'll see. But in a financial sense, yeah, we could do things very bad for Russia.
This threat reverberated around the international arena, and the Kremlin's response became the biggest question of the day. Putin, on the other hand, stated that Trump's peace proposal should be reconsidered and the appropriate places should be changed. The Russian leader made these statements wearing military uniforms for the first time in a long time.
Согласны с предложениями прекратить боевые действия. Но исходим из того, что это прекращение должно быть...
Наша задача в ближайшее время, в кратчайшие сроки, окончательно разгромить противника.
Коллегами, партнерами на этот счет переговорить. Может быть, с президентом Трампом созвониться и вместе с ним пообсуждать. Но сама по себе идея...
Putin, who was seen in military uniforms, made important assessments while visiting a command center in Russia's western Kursk region on the border with Ukraine. The Russian leader suggested the creation of a buffer zone along the border. Russian state media reported that Putin visited the region for the first time since the cross-border operation and instructed his military to push Ukrainian forces back from the region as soon as possible. Russian and North Korean troops deployed to fight alongside Putin's forces have reportedly recently regained control of some villages in the Kursk region. In this regard, the Russian leader shares predictions about what will happen in Kursk. Putin stated that Ukrainian soldiers will be treated as traitors according to the laws of the Russian Federation. This statement was quite harsh and gave important clues about the Russian leader's future approach to both the war in general and what will happen in the Kursk Oblast. Moreover, Putin's wearing of a military uniform, his statements about Kursk, and the conditions he laid down were almost like a message of intimidation to Trump. In fact, the Russian leader said in a statement that he was in favour of a 30-day ceasefire, but emphasised that there were some nuances in the terms he would accept. At a press conference in Moscow, the Russian capital, Mr. Putin said the proposal must lead to a lasting peace in his eyes and address what the Kremlin calls root causes.
В соответствии с нормами международного права и законами Российской Федерации. Для эффективной реализации призыва президента США.
The Russian leader pointed out that the US peace proposal must be revised, or the agreement would not be signed. These were Putin's strategies ahead of his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in early 2022. These strategies included the disarmament of Ukraine and adherence to neutrality status. The Russian leader also stated that an acceptable deal would require Ukraine to stop further troop deployment and training. In addition, Putin also mentioned the absence of military support for Kiev during the ceasefire as one of the conditions sought by Putin. The Russian leader laid out his conditions and gave the US its turn to act again. So what will be the consequences of this showdown between Putin and Trump? Who will be the winner in the peace agreement? For answers to our questions and more, our video begins. But first, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like to be informed about our content. First, let's take a closer look at US President Donald Trump's statements. Donald Trump spoke about the challenges facing Vladimir Putin if Moscow does not support the 30-day ceasefire. Trump said that if Vladimir Putin does not accept the ceasefire, he will continue to send military resources to Ukraine. It is known that US arms shipments are being delivered through Poland's Jasionka Logistics Center. From artillery to tanks, air defense systems to long-range missiles, many Western weapons could join Ukraine's inventory. This could lead to further losses of Russian troops and equipment. In addition to military aid, Trump's most critical move is economic pressure on Russia. President Trump threatened to put economic pressure on Russia if it rejects the ceasefire in Ukraine. Trump said that, "I could do things that would be very bad for Russia. It would be financially devastating for Russia. I don't want to do that. I want peace." Russia, already among the world's largest oil producers, has been subjected to more than 20,000 sanctions imposed by the US and its partners following the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The US alone has imposed some 6,433 sanctions against Russia since February 2022. US sanctions against Russia include measures to limit Russia's oil and gas revenues. These measures include limiting Russia's oil exports to USD 60 per barrel. The sanctions have reduced Russia's trade surplus from $337 billion in 2022, the first year of the war, to $151 billion last year. Among the most painful measures were sanctions on oil exports, which forced Russian companies to sell at a discount, raising logistics and financing costs, and financial sanctions, which made it harder for the country's companies to transact internationally, as well as sanctions on the airline industry. The US worked with other G7 countries to impose sanctions that blocked Russian financial institutions from accessing international capital markets. Russian-made energy faced price ceilings designed to prevent profits from being spent on the war, while oligarchs' yachts and villas were sold and bank accounts frozen. Most of the money is now held in Europe. In the process, Moscow managed to finance the war. But with Donald Trump reconsidering sanctions and tariffs, the circle for Vladimir Putin is narrowing. If Putin does not accept Trump's offer, if he persists in his refusal, much tougher sanctions could hit Russia. By now, it may already be too late, because the US has pressed the button for sanctions against Russia. The Trump administration is imposing further restrictions on Russia's oil, gas and banking sectors, further restricting Russia's access to US payment systems. The Treasury Department ended a 60-day exemption put in place by the Biden administration in January that allowed certain energy transactions involving sanctioned Russian banks to continue. By allowing the exemption to expire, the banks may no longer be able to access US payment systems to conduct large energy transactions. Russian financial institutions exempted from sanctions included Vneshekonombank, Bank Financial Corporation Otkritie, Sovcombank, VTB Bank, Alfa Bank, Rosbank, Bank Zenit, Bank St. Petersburg, and the Central Bank of Russia. The decision of American banking systems makes it harder for other countries to buy Russian oil, thus limiting its global supply. It could lead to a further price increase of up to $5 per barrel, a significant jump after the low prices of recent weeks. Given all these circumstances, Vladimir Putin has 6 reasons to sign the peace deal. Relations with Washington are more important than military gains on the ground in Ukraine. As Russian National Guard Chief Viktor Zolotov said, "Ukraine is where the border between the US and Russia crosses." Putin has always maintained that the Maidan Revolution of 2014 was a coup organized by the West, and that the Kiev regime are puppets of Washington. Therefore, according to his logic, the only way to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO and becoming a strategic threat to Russia is to make a deal with the puppet masters in Washington. Trump is unpredictable and could turn against Putin as suddenly as he turned against him. It is easy to forget that in his first term, Trump was much tougher on Putin than Obama, sanctioning Gazprom's Nord Stream 2 pipeline and increasing military aid to Kiev. Senator Lindsey Graham has threatened that the US will impose sanctions on countries importing Russian oil and gas if Putin does not accept the deal. Mainly India, but also Europe, which still gets 13% of its energy from Russia and growing. These would be the kind of harsh sanctions that could really collapse the Russian economy. the war is slowly strangling the Russian economy. Although it has weathered the sanctions much better than expected, Russia suffers from high inflation and interest rates. GDP growth, fueled by military spending, is stagnating, and there is a crippling shortage of skilled labour and investment. War spending consumes 40% of Putin's state budget. Russian elites want to get rich and travel again. The fundamental fallacy behind Western sanctions since 2014 was that Russia's oligarchs would see Putin as bad for business and rein in his geopolitical adventures. In the end, Putin ignored the business community and wiped billions of dollars from their fortunes with his self-appointed world historic mission to liberate Russians in eastern Ukraine in order to deeply secure his country's borders. But after 3 years of war, the elite began to resent travel restrictions, personal sanctions, and frozen bank accounts. The short duration of the ceasefire gives Putin plenty of room to demand concessions from Kiev, especially on the formula for Ukraine's future neutrality and the size of its army. If he gets nowhere, Putin can always go on the offensive. 1 month will not give the Ukrainians time to significantly strengthen or regroup. Putin has a better chance of controlling Ukraine through the ballot box than through violence. Since Ukraine's independence in 1991, Moscow has sought to control Kiev's elite through an endless mix of macroeconomic bribery, personal corruption, funding of pro-Russian opposition parties, and propaganda. The full-scale occupation in 2022 was partly due to the failure of these mechanisms to change Ukraine's pro-Western course. But having spent trillions of rubles and 700,000 casualties to take only 19% of Ukraine's territory, Putin may calculate that the time has come to return to the old pattern and try to influence Kiev from within. What if Vladimir Putin continues to reject the ceasefire to try to revise it? Putin believes that he is the Grand Master of geopolitics. He lives in a celebrity information bubble and is surrounded by sycophants who, like him, were trained in the 1970s KGB. Trump's sudden sympathy for Putin and anger at Ukraine is partly due to Trump's personal grudges against Zelensky, and partly because he is impatient to end the war. Trump sees no vital US interest in Russia or Ukraine, but the people around Putin could arrogantly decide that the world is suddenly going their way and press for more concessions. Putin's foreign policy has always been opportunistic. He takes what he can get. The biggest danger for peace in Ukraine is Putin's arrogance and tendency to overreach. The Kremlin's continued tight control over Russia's information space will allow Putin's propagandists to turn any outcome of the war into a victory. But questions will be asked, especially by right-wing ultra-nationalist Russians, by those who describe themselves as patriots, about what this enormous sacrifice is for. If Ukraine continues on its pro-Western course and remains democratic and free, it will be clear that the occupation has achieved nothing. This could seriously damage Putin's image as the infallible protector of his people. It is difficult to get an objective picture of morale inside the Russian army, but military bloggers offer plenty of stories about the sadism of commanders, executions of their own men, massive corruption and cynicism in the Russian army. Most Russian soldiers serve only to collect big rewards or to get out of jail. Once the war is paused, it may be difficult to reactivate this motley force. At the beginning of the war, Putin's propagandists tried to portray the invasion of Ukraine as a version of the USSR's fight against the Nazis. Paramilitary youth groups were formed and school children paraded. As the war progressed, the tendency was to downplay the special military operation, which often did not even make the top 3 items on the national TV evening news. Unlike the warring states of Orwell's 1984, the regime does not base its legitimacy solely on perpetual war. Indeed, in his last State of the Nation address in November, Putin spent 4 times more time talking about welfare and social programs than about war. Still, Putin poses as the protector of his people from the warlike West. If he suddenly strikes a deal with Washington, what will his narrative be? There is a huge political and social responsibility for demobilizing hundreds of thousands of war-traumatized, violent extremists. As Yevgeny Prigozhin's rebellion showed, there was a groundswell of support among ultra-nationalists that Wagner had been stabbed in the back and that the war could have been won if not for the parquet generals and corrupt politicians. The biggest threat to Putin's power comes not from pro-Western liberals like the late Alexei Navalny, but from the nationalist right, which can easily develop a narrative of betrayal against the thieving Kremlin. But are Ukrainians ready for a ceasefire and concessions? Unsurprisingly, 3 years of a brutal war of aggression have created enormous stress among a population increasingly fed up with the war. A December 2024 survey by the respected Kiev International Institute of Sociology, or KIIS, found that almost 9 in 10 Ukrainians had experienced at least one stressful situation in the previous year. A large proportion reported stressful experiences related to bombings and shelling, separation from family members, surviving the death of loved ones, and illness of loved ones. Only 10% said they had not experienced any stressful situations. Similarly, surveys showed that by summer 2024, 84% of the population had experienced some form of violence. This could be physical injury at the hands of Russian forces, displacement, loss of family members or friends, or witnessing attacks. And consistent with a growing number of news reports, we found that Ukrainians are deeply concerned about combat fatigue among their own citizens. Only 10% said they were not at all concerned about combat fatigue. While the war continues, several polls show that Ukrainians are increasingly in favour of negotiations. The proportion of the population in favour of negotiations varies depending on how the question is asked. A Gallup poll conducted in late 2024 showed that when asked to choose between 2 options, 52% favoured that Ukraine should start negotiations to end the war as soon as possible, while 38% preferred that Ukraine should continue fighting until it wins the war. As polls in 2022 and 2024 negotiations. In contrast, all compromises for accessions. The proportion of the population in favour of negotiations varies depending on how the question is asked. A Gallup poll conducted in late 2024 showed that when asked to choose between 2 options, 52% favoured that Ukraine should start negotiations to end the war as soon as possible, while 38% preferred that Ukraine should continue fighting until it wins the war. Previous polls in 2022 and 2024 similarly show a growing preference for negotiations. In contrast to the Gallup question, our polls offered respondents different regional compromises for a ceasefire. About a third wanted an immediate ceasefire, while half wanted to continue fighting until all regions, including the predominantly Russian-speaking Donbass region and Crimea, were returned to Kyiv's control. But the poll results make it clear that the country's political independence is a red line for public opinion, even at the very high cost of defending it. Along with growing support for negotiations, polls show a growing willingness to give up territory. And the willingness to give up territory is higher among those most concerned about war fatigue and more pessimistic about continued Western support. However, most Ukrainians still want Ukraine to keep fighting until the country's territorial integrity is restored and Kiev's control is restored, including Crimea. But this majority has declined since the start of the war, from 71% in 2022 to 51% in 2024. When we asked people in July 2024 whether they agreed with the statement Russia should be allowed to control the territories it has occupied since 2022, 90% disagreed. So there is little evidence that Russia's territorial annexations will have any legitimacy among the Ukrainian people. Neither Zelensky nor most Ukrainians trust Putin, so there is a strong preference for any deal accompanied by security guarantees from NATO countries. Last month's KIES poll findings reveal that 66% of Ukrainians interpret Russia's war aims as an existential threat to Ukrainians, including genocide and the destruction of their independent statehood. And 87% believe that Russia will not stop in the territories it already occupies. Negotiating with an enemy bent on Ukraine's destruction seems like wishful thinking to many Ukrainians. As a defiant wartime leader, President Zelensky's popularity was sky high in the months immediately following the invasion. Indeed, KII's polls in May 2022 show that 90% of the population trusted him. This declined as the war continued, but always remained above 50%. Recent polls put his approval at 63%, an increase from 2024. Indeed, the most recent KIIS polls, conducted from February to March this year, showed a 10-point jump in his confidence rating to 67%. This finding is widely seen as a rebound against US criticism. Zelensky's approval of any ceasefire and compromise will therefore be important, but the loss of territory is likely to be politically dangerous for him. While the US-Ukraine agreement on a ceasefire puts the ball in Russia's court, it is unclear whether it will be enough to bring Putin to the table. And even if he does, given past precedents, it is hard to see him emerging as a conqueror rather than a conciliator. What is clear is that any peace that emerges is more likely to depend on Ukraine making concessions and accepting losses. Such a peace can be negotiated behind closed doors, but whether it can be sustained on the ground without public acceptance in Ukraine is another matter. Thank you for watching.